So I want to introduce Peter T. Prior to starting his bonsai career, Peter worked as an auto mechanic. He began practicing the art of bonsai in 2003. Initially, he studied with Boone. In 2011, he traveled to Japan. He apprenticed. And after he completed his apprenticeship, he started his business and now creates bonsai, manages bonsai collections, provides instruction to individuals and groups. Peter's attention to detail and ability to teach good structural development from the roots from the apex help many bonsai hobbyists vastly improve their collections. He's currently based in Northern California and will be going to his garden on our bus trip in May. And he has worked with many incredible bonsai enthusiasts across the US. I'm happy to introduce my sensei, Peter T. Take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for having me. So there's a sheet that's being passed back. Did you guys all get that? So again, my name is Peter T. If you want to visit my website, it's PT, as in the letter P and the letter T, bonsai.com. You can find this diagram. You can find fertilizing information, monthly write-ups about what I would normally do at certain months. There's a gallery there. I also sell annealed copper wire, and I also sell trees on my site. And so if you ever wanted to come up and visit my place, my email's there. You can just email me and we'll figure something out. Again, the bus tour is coming to my house in May. I think it's May. So you can come at that time too. All right, so let's get right into it. So you can see I brought a number of trees. And there's different types of trees. At the end there, that's a Seiju elm. The one next to it is also a Seiju elm. There's a black pine. Then there's a procumbens nana juniper. There's a trident maple, trident maple, trident maple, trident maple, and trident maple, if you guys saw that earlier. Okay. So what I'm trying to do, or at least on some of these trees, I'm trying to bring some progressions in how trees are developed. And so that will help with this diagram also. And to kind of get you on the right track of how you would start your bonsai, okay? So just jumping to the, not so much the end, but let's just say we'll jump to this tree. And can everybody kind of see this? So that's a trident maple. I've worked on it for the last, it's my client's tree. And we started working on it really about 10 years ago or so. Okay. Now the tree was already a certain size, the trunk was a certain size. I developed the root spread, and I developed most of the branches that you see on the tree. Okay. Now when you look at a tree like this, or you go to a show and you see a tree that's finished, sometimes it's tricky to figure out, well, okay, how was that created? Especially if you're your own bonsai, you're trying to get better at it. You start looking at it, and one thing you can do is you can kind of reverse engineer it and figure out, okay, from what I know about how trees grow, can I kind of break this tree down and figure out, okay, well, what did Peter do to get it to this shape? And if this is a shape that that you're interested in, or say like that Seiju elm at the end of the table, it really starts with what I'm going to be talking about today. So let's start at the beginning. So what is this sheet all about? You can see as a tree, there's some crude branches on there, and there's a bunch of numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So what those numbers represent, the first thing they represent is priority. What should you focus on first? Okay, number 1 is generally what you would focus on first. And if you've been in the club a while, you've talked to a lot of bonsai people, they'll always say, okay, when you're looking for a tree, make sure you find a trunk that you really like, okay? Do you know why they tell you that? That's right, because the trunk is generally the oldest part, and that's the hardest part to change. So for example, if I said, this is my tree, and I said, I wish the trunk was 3 times as wide, okay? That's a little bit more tricky, or at least more time consuming if I just said, hey, that main branch that I'm growing, I just need that to be a little bit bigger. You're like, okay, I think after spring it's going to be thick enough. But if you're trying to grow that trunk 3 times the size, you have some time that you have to dedicate to that. So you definitely don't want to pick up a tree, look at the trunk and say, I wish it was bigger, because it might take you a long time. Now, if you put that tree in the ground, talking about time, how long would it take for it to become 3 times the size? Okay. Now, yeah, in the beginning, that's perfect because we don't know, right? So you go in not knowing, and then you say you put it in the ground because somebody said growing in the ground is the fastest way. And then they tell you, and then someone later tells you that, yeah, you got to let things blow out, and it's going to take 4 years or 5 years, okay? All of a sudden, you're kind of like, maybe I should have just looked for one that was the size I wanted and not spend 5 years, okay? There's also other things to deal with in those 5 years. Now, if you run into the opposite situation where you look at the trunk and you said, I wish this trunk was just smaller, that might be impossible. That's really hard to make a tree shrink down. We can always grow it, it's harder to shrink it. So number one, priority. We're focusing on the oldest part of the tree, and we want to make sure we're happy with that. Okay, and you see how it goes from 1 to 2, but there's 2 2s. The first 2 is the continuation of the trunk, so you're going vertical. The other 2, you're going horizontal, and let's just say that's your main branch. Again, this picture right here is just an illustration to help you. We lost the picture. Oh, there we go. To kind of understand this concept or this fundamental building concept. The trees that you're going to be working on are going to be a little bit more complex than this, but know that this fundamental 1 to 2 to 3 is within every single tree you see here. And if anything, it helps you kind of organize your thoughts when you're looking at the tree. Like, I think I need to start here. If you're not happy with number 1, it probably doesn't matter if you're happy with number 7, okay? Then number 7, which is right at the top of the tree, is also the youngest part of the tree. That's the easiest part to change. You can cut it off, you'll always grow. That stuff at the end is always 1 year old, okay? Then the next grows, it's 1 year old again, okay? And you're thinking about, well, I want number 1 to be bigger, okay? 7 is not a priority at that time. So when you go from 1 to 2, that represents that you're satisfied with what you did with number 1. Now you're moving to 2, and you notice that's a division. 1 goes vertical, 1 goes horizontal. So that's a division. And how do you get that division? Usually it requires some kind of cutting if you're building this tree. You make a cut, you get the tree to give you 2 branches, let's say, for example, and now you have to grow those branches to the size that you want. Now, if you purchase the tree and you look at number 1 and you say, number 1, I like that. And you look at number 2 and you say, I like that. Oh, perfect. You don't have to mess around with number 2. Now you're moving to number 3, your next division. So when you're looking in the middle of the tree, see how that's the second branch coming off on the left? And then you're working on the third portion of the trunk. But on your first branch, you're working on your next division there too. So there's 3 3s, and then so forth. So that's what the numbers mean. It means priority, and if you're moving to the next number, that means you're thinking about a division. Okay. And in this diagram, you get an idea of, okay, it went from 2 to 3, what's the spacing like? Now, you don't have to copy this because that's just a picture. But when you're trying to develop a tree, that spacing from 2 to 3 is whatever you want to do. The important part is understanding that I want something to divide here, and you get it to divide there. Not I want it to divide here, and it divides here. And you're like, okay, I guess I'll just roll with it. Okay, how do you get it to divide where you want? So on the first branch, when it transitions from 2 to 3, you see there's a division right there. That means I was satisfied with number 2. I made a cut somewhere right there, and where those 2 branches come up to be number 3, those are the response from that cut. If number 2 is very long and I cut it where number 5 is, for example, then number 3 would start there. Normally I have a whiteboard and I draw a lot of this stuff out, but I brought the whiteboard, but no marker, sorry. So I'm just talking. If any of you have questions, feel free to ask also, okay? Right. Because sometimes I might go through things real quick, and if it's not clear, I want it to be clear in what I'm trying to tell you here. So when you get into bonsai, and you're thinking about, well, how do I grow this tree to be this shape? Well, you have to understand how trees grow. Okay, seems simple enough, but surprising, a lot of people don't think too much about that. They're like, well, they grow, right? And then you don't think much about it. They kind of divide on their own. Maybe you cut a few branches and it kind of does this thing. But what does a tree really want to do? If you break it down fundamentally, what a tree really wants to do is it wants to grow and become a full-size tree, right? That's what most trees want to do. What do bushes do? They become bigger bushes. They might not be as tall as a tree, but they can be fairly tall. And then there's just like this big round ball. So you got to know that every single one of these trees that you see in front of you, maybe not so much the procumbens nana, can become full-size trees, especially a trident maple. They're not going to be as tall as a redwood, but if I had brought a redwood that was small, you know how big redwoods can grow, okay? But somehow they're small, right? So it requires our manipulation to keep them small. But you can't forget that what a tree always wants to do, if you stop working on it or you let it do its own thing, is that it will become a larger tree and it'll do large tree stuff. So for example, if I have this tree and all the branches are kind of skinny on there on the outside, if I let those branches grow and I don't say prune it at a certain time, those branches will continue growing, just like this example right here. And those branches will get thicker. Just like if you were growing a trunk, it will get thicker. And what happens is that the tree will put more food into these branches because it's the branch that's helping the tree get bigger. So what do you think happens to the little tiny branches that don't become bigger? They kind of go bye-bye, right? They get shaded out. They're in a weakened position. The tree's like, this branch is winning. It's growing. It's helping me out. And this little tiny guy's barely struggling. And so usually what the tree does, the tree then gets rid of those weak branches. So all it takes for me to lose some of these small branches is allowing some of them to grow out this big, and you'll start seeing some dieback of the small stuff. And generally in bonsai, that's what we want. We want the small stuff. Or at least if we want something thicker, we have to kind of regulate how we get that thickness. Or like 1 to 2 to 3, we prioritize. What do we thicken first before we worry about dividing? So when we go from 1 to 2, and you're satisfied with 1, what are you looking for? I mean, there's a whole topic just on that. It's going to be dependent on the tree, but let's keep it simple. Let's just think about size of the trunk. How do you get a branch or a trunk to get bigger, thicker? What do you do to the tree? Okay, you can cut the smaller branches to help the big ones really take off. But what really helps, or what really gets the trunk or the branch to thicken is to allow it to grow, right? Okay. Like these branches right here. So when you're working on number 1 or 2, say you went from 1 to 2, and say 2 is a little too skinny, or it's a new branch that's coming off the trunk, like this guy right here. The new branch comes out, it's a certain length, maybe you decide to wire it because you want it to have a certain amount of movement, and then you move on to thinking about, well, how thick do I need this branch? Does it need to be the size of my thumb, finger, 4 inches? Okay. It's going to be relative to your trunk size and and what you're trying to create. Just a general guide, if you're not sure how big your main branch should be, let's say we'll use this trident again as an example, is that generally it should be about wherever you see the branch. This is not always 100%, but you can use it as a guide. See this branch right here and where it's coming off in the trunk? However wide it is right there in the trunk, if that branch is about 25 to 30% that size, that's a pretty good main branch, pretty good size. If you start getting into closer to 50%, it starts looking like a second trunk. Okay, if you go over, then for sure it looks like a second trunk. But first of all, well, wait a minute. Why do we even want number 2 to be bigger? Why is that important? Or is it even important? Bonsai would be a lot easier if we didn't have to do that. Right? It'll save us a lot of time. Because how long does it take for me to grow number 2 for that tree now? Okay, that branch has been growing, that branch grew last year. So that's 1 year. So if you didn't know how thick a branch can get on a trident, that's how thick it can grow in 1 year in a pot. Okay. Can you grow it a little bit faster than that? For sure. Okay. Depends what kind of soil you use, how you fertilize the tree. So why do we need thicker branches or different size branches? Any idea? Balance? Heard balance? Probably balance in the sense that when you look at old trees, usually the lowest branch tends to be fairly thick, right? You know the trunk, number 1, is the oldest part of the tree. The second oldest part of the tree is probably the second half of the trunk, but the side branches, there's going to be one that was there from the beginning or close to the beginning. So your main branch might actually be just a little older than the tree itself, okay? And having size kind of shows that. And having changes in sizes. When you go from 2 to 3 and there's a tapering down of the branches all the way to number 5 or number 7 where the branches are very small, it gives you this big timeline of here's your tree. Okay, there's the older branches. And you can see as it gets younger and younger and younger, which gives you this kind of long timeline. It's like, wow, this tree's been around. If you had a trunk that was big and all the branches are skinny from top to bottom, it looks a little weird because trees don't grow that way anyways. They're like, why is that bottom branch like this? Or even worse, it's smaller than the branches up atop. That's not very common. So that's why I focus a lot on making sure, say, number 2 or number 3 are the sizes that I want. When you look at this branch right here, this branch was grown to that size. And at one point, that size was big enough. I made some cuts. And during the break, or even as I'm talking, feel free to come up and look at things real close. That's important because you might not be able to see it from the back. You can kind of see where I made the cuts and where the next division happened. And I grew that to a certain thickness. You can see the cut because there's a callus there. And you can see the tree then dividing. And you can kind of start reading the tree. Okay, Peter grew this out and then he cut it here. This looks like the responding branches that came from it. He grew those out to be a certain thickness. And then I see a cut point, and then it moves on to another division with smaller and smaller branches, all the way to the point where this entire tree now, I'm just trying to grow smaller branches and get it wider and add more branches. I'm not trying to thicken stuff anymore. Now, without making it too technical with the cutting aspect, is at some point when number 1 or number 2 on this diagram is the size that you want, you do have to figure out, well, where do you want to make a cut to move to number 3? Is the cut right here? Is the cut over here? Because wherever you make that cut, that's where the division is going to start. Let's use this as an example. Here's a branch. And you guys can see the nodes. They're kind of pointy. They're about to open. And we know that the tree wants to get bigger. Okay, say I interrupt that and I cut it right here. Where is it going to grow once I cut it right here? Does it grow right there, closest to the cut? Does it grow here, 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 here? What do you think? It's what? Closest to the cut. That's right. Now, if I cut here and these 2 buds right here grow the strongest, why is that? Right? It's got the more light. It's in a position to make the tree bigger, essentially, right? And so earlier when I said, what is the goal of this tree? If it can't get bigger here and I cut it here, it's going to try to get bigger here. Okay. What if I wanted to bud right here? Where do I cut it? You're not going to cut it here, right? Because you know what happens if you cut it here. You're not going to cut it here. because it would just bud here. You have to cut it where you want it to divide. Which is funny in a way because you can grow this branch out. And let's just say I spent 3 years growing that branch, and now it's the size that I want. Now I have to ask myself, I'm moving from 2 to 3, where do I want it to divide? Is it here, 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 or is it right here? And generally it's right here. The problem with that is that you spend a lot of time growing this to cut most of it off, and it's kind of painful in a way. And you're kind of like, is the tree okay? Right? Okay, it'll be okay. Some trees, maybe you can't cut that hard, so you have to step it back. You know, some trees, they can't respond if you cut such an aggressive cutoff. And then so you have to do a cut here, get it a little stronger, cut here, and then chase it back. So there's always some trees where you might have to do that. Trident maples are not the case. So if you're consistent in those cuts, and say you're growing, it's thickness that you want, you cut it, new branches come out, you wire those branches, you let them grow to a certain thickness. Once they're the thickness that you want, you're moving from now 3 to 4. You cut those branches back where you want it to divide, and you keep building. Yes.
Is there any circumstance where you would want it to divide further out just to make that branch grow more? Like if it has more leaves, is getting more energy from that branch, would it make the base of the branch grow quicker? Is there ever a circumstance where you would do that?
If you don't cut the branch as hard or where you want it to grow, right? And so say I cut it here when I really wanted to cut it there. Now, when these guys start to grow, will it help make this branch thicker? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. It does, but technically, I'll just say, generally speaking, it does not. Okay. Because if you wanted this branch to be thicker, you just let this keep going. Okay. So cutting interrupts that. Having said that, just like a bush that you have in front of your house or in your backyard, or just bushes that you see in the park, you know, every now and then they shear the, gardeners will shear the bush. And you know that when they planted those bushes, they were small, but now the trunks are big. And they never allowed it to really run. They just kept cutting it. So over time, as the tree builds branches, you can get a branch to thicken. It's just not the fastest way to do it. It does happen. It just takes a long time. Okay. So that's why I don't normally go that direction. Because as I'm trying to do that here, what does the tree want? What does the tree keep wanting to do up here? It keeps wanting to grow and get bigger. And now you're fighting this all the time. And then you're fighting this from getting bigger, and you're going kind of like the slow route and getting that thicker. You want to get it, let's get it thick and start moving and building the tree. So when you move from this and say you're satisfied with the first branches, say the number 2, at some point you make a cut. And if you get a closer look at this tree, you can see the same thing. Sometimes some of those old cuts are hard because it's all healed and everything is grown around it, and you can't even tell there was a cut there anymore. But you can see that generally speaking, on this tree, every division you see is because I made a cut and the tree responded. And then I worked those new branches, and then I cut those branches, and then they responded, they divided, and now you have a bunch of branches. Okay. Now, when you look at a tree like this, and you see how all the branches are short, just like the branches are a little longer on this one, is that because the tree keeps wanting to get bigger as you're trying to grow these guys out, and at some point you have to cut it and get it to divide, you have to keep these guys on top small so that you can be successful in growing the bottom. Because if you don't and you let the top grow, what does the bottom branch do? Slows down. Why do they slow down? Because the tree wants to get bigger. Okay. So essentially, the tree's trying to grow and get bigger. I'm making a cut and I'm redirecting the food to branches that I want the tree to grow thicker. Okay, so you're just shifting around where the food is. And so, well, I really want that branch to be thick. Okay. Can this tree grow that branch thick on its own if you just plant in the ground? Yeah, it just may not pick the one that you want. And it's like this one that grows. Okay. If any of you have planted a tree in the past and it's just a little tiny guy, does the first lowest branch ever really make it 40 years later when you're looking at this tree? Usually that first branch is like up there. They never make it. Okay. And we're trying to keep a branch this low on the trunk alive. Okay. So As you're building, can I get that diagram up again? As you're building from step 1 to 2 to 3, this is just technical building stuff. And this applies to black pines, junipers, any tree you work on. It's just where you're growing the branches might be in a different position. And maybe in some areas for certain types of trees, taper change is not as important. So you can kind of fudge that a little bit. But as you're building your tree from 1 to 2 to 3, you see how the tree is getting slightly bigger each time, which is very normal. If you're starting here and your finish is here, sometimes the name of the game is, well, how many branches can you fit in that space? Is it just one cut and then 2 cuts and now you're at number 5? You're at the silhouette of your tree? That's not a lot of branches on your tree. If you go from 1 to 2 to 4 and you're already at your silhouette, the size that you want. What if you cut things a little closer and by the time you get to 5, there's 5 cuts, let's say. 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16. Well, maybe that was 5. Okay, sorry. But you see how within that same space, if your cuts are strict or very short, or you keep a little bit of the tree every time, you can fit a lot of branches by the time you get to the size that you want. That's the reason why this tree, all the branches are very close. Because I'm not jumping to the final size so quickly. If this tree is supposed to be this size, I don't just cut here. I'm like, I'm there with my 1, 2, 3 branches. Or is it going to be there with a bunch of branches? And this tree technically is not finished, okay? This tree is not wide enough. It should be about this wide. So I still have 4 inches on the top, maybe 5, 6 inches. Here's 7 inches. There's 6 inches of space for me to put more and more branches. Now, why do I want to have so many branches? Well, it's just like having thick branches. If you have a lot of branches on the tree and there's some taper change, it makes the tree look older. Like you never look at an old tree and we're like, wow, there's only like 2 branches. Never happens. There's like a lot of branches. So many branches that you just can't count them all. So if you can recreate that on your tree, like when you look at that elm, you can get a lot of density in that tree, more so than a trident maple. And when you look into it, it makes you feel like you're looking more like at an older tree. It's a lot to see, okay? And everyone in this room, if you follow this guide right here, now again, this is just a crude picture. There's a little bit more to it. But fundamentally speaking, all of these trees and progressions are the trees that are a little bit further along. It's these steps right here. Making sure that you prioritize. I'm working on number 2. I got to get that to grow. If I cut it, it's not going to grow, and it's going to delay the thickening of that branch. So I got to let it run. Now, what happens if you have a 4, you have a 5 up on top? What do you do with those? Well, you can't let them just grow either. So you have to cut them often and keep them growing slow while you're working on the key numbers. You want to make sure you're finished with number 2 before you move to number 3. Okay. And me saying this up here seems straightforward. You know, let's step 1, step 2, step 3. But when you start working on a tree, even in this case, I convinced one of my clients that we should grow it thicker. And I said it's going to take 2 years. And they're like, man, 2 years? I'm paying for this? And it's like sticking out. And their friends are looking at it and be like, shouldn't you do something with that? All right, and you're like, no, Peter said we got to grow it. And they're like, oh, I don't know. Okay. And then you're growing it as the size that you want. And now you're accustomed to it because you grew this branch, right? It's like growing anything. And like, hey, I did it. It's thick enough. The day finally arrived, it's thick enough. And I say, cut it right here. All right? Because I want the division to start there. And you're like, my branch, you know, all that expensive fertilizer, bonsai soil, paying me for workshops and all that stuff just for this little nub. Okay. All right. And that's hard to do. And that's only step one. Okay. So you can get past that because it's just this big nub. You're like, okay, I trust you. You make the cut, 2 branches come out, let's say, and you grow them to, say, this thickness. So you don't have to grow it as long, which is good. And it's leafing out, and you're kind of like, well, I kind of have something again. There's something to look at. It's not a nub. And then those 2 branches are finally thick enough, and then I cut them to a little nub, like these guys. And you're like, oh, man, what's going on here? Okay. The good part is that as you develop that, it does start moving faster, because when you get to something like this, now you're scrambling because this is going to grow and you're like, I got to cut it. If I let it grow too big, it's going to kill the other small branches. And now it becomes the reverse. It's not a waiting game. You're like, oh, Peter, I got to work on this again. It was nice when I was just growing it. All right. So when you're looking at these 3 trees here, it's a good example of essentially this sheet right here, the progression. And during the break, or even while I'm talking, take a look at this tree, take a look at this tree, take a look at this tree, even take a look at this guy, because I'll probably do something with that one. This is the raffle tree. That's a trident maple too. Okay. You got to remember, let's see if I can. You can kind of see that. Okay. So that was a field-grown tree, and then it got put in a pot. Okay. You have to remember that every single one of these trees was that or smaller at some point. And someone had to grow it to the shape that you see. It wasn't automatic. Okay. That elm at the end, the Seiju elm that has a lot of branches, I bought that tree in 2016. And I cut off every single branch on that tree, except for the trunk and that secondary trunk. So it was all nubs. And so from that point on, the nice thing about elms, they grow fairly fast and their internodes are very short, so it's easier to develop. But at some point, it was just like this, where I cut off a bunch of branches, and you see those new branches coming out. And they have some movement and they're sticking out. You know why they're sticking out? It's because I'm trying to thicken them. And they're not cut yet because they're not thick enough yet. Or at least I haven't looked at it that close. Maybe 1 or 2 might be thicker and it's time to cut. So even the tree on the right that's more finished, at one point it looked like the tree on the left. You just have to come to the realization that when you're building trees to look like a finished tree, there's times where the tree doesn't look that good because you're just doing technical building. I got to thicken this branch. There's nothing artistic about that. Okay. You're just letting it run. That's just part of the process. You work on something else. As those branches get thicker, you make the cuts, you work on the next one. And before you know it, you'll have the tree on the right. Everybody in this room is capable of creating that tree on the right. As long as you know the steps, you understand how a tree grows. I'm essentially outlining at least the technical side of it. It can be technically good and still be an ugly tree. You know, that's the artistic side of it, right? Okay. But there's no doubt that every one of us can get a branch to divide or to thicken. And really kind of how you care for the tree or the timing of the cuts will allow you to keep more of the branches. So the tree doesn't kill off small branches and only the strong survives. This is a little bit trickier, but fundamentally speaking, it's the same. Junipers are a little hard to show you that. Fundamentally, it's the same. It's because we get kind of trapped into the fact that it has kind of a little cluster of growth instead of just one leaf. So you see a cluster of growth, you're like, ah, it's nice, tree's puffy, I want to keep it. When it turns out that it's still step 1, step 2. And then when you cut it to move on to step 3, it hurts because this puff's gone and it's just a little scraggly thing. Because you're trying to get whatever's left to grow and they do their thing. At some point, as you're building the tree, after you do the cut, it's not like, oh, my tree looks ugly. You're like, this looks pretty good. And it looks good every time you work on it now. You just got to get to that. It does happen. It's only a matter of time. Okay. Any questions so far? Does that make sense? Is it fairly clear? Okay. I don't normally learn things just hearing things once, but if you look at this sheet, kind of think about it, some things might pop. Yeah. Question? Oh, the mic. Yeah.
For the sacrifice branches, what's the limit of how many can you have going at once before the effort is spread out too thin?
Oh, I see. So if, say, I wanted to grow this branch, and it's just one branch right now, right? Should I have grown two or something like that?
Well, like
yeah.
on that other tree, you have a bunch going.
Oh, yeah. So generally, like on this tree, usually the sacrifice or the branches I'm growing out tends to be close to the bottom. And everything above it gets cut fairly short. So everything grows to this bottom. The time that I have, say, this branch going, and if I allow a branch here to run and do the same thing, inevitably that middle branch will catch up and surpass this bottom branch. And so that's why there isn't a running branch here. Now with that elm, because I might not have to grow the branches that thick, I do have to be careful. I'm trying to fudge it a little bit where I can do the bottom branches and kind of the mid ones. But the minute those mid-level branches start growing a little faster than the bottom branches, I'm going to cut them because I got to prioritize. I got to get those bottom branches to grow. Okay. Because if you're working on the other branches and you're in 4, 5, 6, they get in the way of the bottom branches if finally you're moving to number 2. Because the canopy might be too big. And now it's shading out the bottom branches. So you have to be able to hold this stuff back while you're just getting the work done on the bottom. Now, when you get into junipers where taper or thickness of branch or the ability to manipulate large branches exists, you might not have to grow a branch. You just bend the big branch that you see into the position you want, and you're like, I got it. That's nice. And taper on a juniper is not as important as on a deciduous tree. So you get to skip a lot of steps sometimes. You'll look at it and say, oh, 2, 3, 4 is already good. I can use that. And now you're really working on 4, 5, 6. Okay. But again, fundamentally speaking, those are just little shortcuts you pick up along the way for different species. But inevitably, even with a juniper, if you want to do it right, you still got to go through the process. Step 2, 3, 4. Where do I want those divisions? Am I cutting it enough to get those divisions close? Okay. When somebody looks at the tree and says, that tree is full, or when I say that tree is dense, I don't mean that the foliage is dense. Because you can have 2 branches and 2 giant green tufts at the end, and it looks very full. But you really only have 2 branches. Okay. So when I look at a tree and I say it's full, what I really mean, or dense, what I really mean is that there's a high amount of division and branches in your tree. That's what gives you your density. And usually what happens is that you'll have a lot of branches, and the green at the end of those branches are smaller. So you have a bunch of little growths on your tree, supported by a bunch of branches. And your tree looks much older and less young. At the end, if we have time, we'll go through an exercise and figure out, I'm not sure how I'm going to go with it, but I'm going to try to get you guys to practice on looking at which tree and deciding which one's actually the higher quality tree based on what you've learned today. Because when you look at a tree and now you know where to prioritize things, how you see the tree is going to change. You might not get fooled by number 7 anymore. Yes. Oh, we're gonna get you the mic. Sorry. It's for the Zoom folks.
On the first tree, you talked about it being wider, that it needs to be a little wider.
Yeah.
Now, will you just cut back the branches and force them to keep coming out?
Yeah, so what's gonna happen is I already cut this tree this winter. So in the springtime, when it starts to leaf out, it'll start to extend and come out, and I'll let it grow a certain amount. So there'll be a bunch of new growth on the whole tree. So then I'll go through and I'll cut it back, but I'll keep a little bit of that new growth. And so when I keep that little bit, I've added onto the tree. It then divides, and then you do the same thing. You keep a little bit each time. Now, with a trident maple, when you're looking at this branch right here, you see how they have internodes? There's a node, internode is the space in between. The space in between, nothing will ever grow there. And you can see how there's a space here, the space is shorter here, the space is this long here, okay? You see how if I'm trying to add a little bit each time and the tree wants to grow this much, I can't add 2 inches every time, right? That's so fast. So now we get into figuring out, well, how do we grow the tree at a rate that supports what we're trying to build, right? So if you have a tree and you're trying to develop it, especially if it's a maple, and you grow it really strong and the internodes are very long, it's hard to get the branches real small like this because you're forced to keep this much every time. And you see how your tree gets significantly bigger real fast, right? 1 year, 2 years, oh, that's the size of my tree already, okay? And you can't fit a lot of branches in there. Okay. Any questions? No? Yes, Vince? Okay, Mike's coming.
So when you're starting those branches, how do you keep the internodes short?
Oh, how do I keep, okay, so
Like on your longer branch there,
this one.
how
yeah.
do you keep the internodes short at the beginning of that thing so that you can cut back to the shorter internode?
That's right, that's right. So that's when you get into trees that have long internodes, then the strategy is in cutting. We talked about, okay, if I wanted to bud right here, if I cut it and make that bud the new terminal bud, it's going to grow. But the problem now is that if I cut it off, will it grow an internode too big and now I can't use it? So for example, say this was a brand new tree or like this tree, I chop all the branches off and I leave a node, a little, not a node, but a little nub. And I'm trying to force it to bud from the base of that branch. Let's just say I chop this off. At the base of that branch is a node. That's where that branch came from. And you can get that node to wake up and grow you a new branch. The problem is if I cut this branch that's really strong, that new bud that's going to come out the base is going to get all the food that that branch is going to get, and it can grow too long, and now it's not usable to you. So let's work this out. I have a tree that grows, we'll just use this as an example. I have a tree that's growing a node this long. I want it to grow here, but I don't want it to grow a long internode there. But I know that if I cut here and make it the terminal end, it's going to get all the food and it's going to be long, and now I can't use it. Where do I cut instead? Well, you don't cut further down because then you lost it, right? Okay. So again, I'll just point this one. Let's say that's the one you want, but you want it to grow small. You know cutting here is going to grow big. Can you cut here, the next node up? What happens when you cut here is that this is the terminal end, and this is now a secondary bud. And where does the tree grow the strongest? Okay. And where does it grow weaker? Inside, lower. And so now this bud becomes the sacrifice branch when you come here. The internode's long here because it's the leader. The secondary grows shorter. This third one might pop or it may not because that's even weaker. Most of the time on a trident, if you go one pass, you can weaken it, use this bud as a sacrifice, and then once this bud has grown and it's slowed down, maybe you have to cut it again. And these are short, then you go back and cut it. Which is a very important point in bonsai. When you first start and you join a club and you're working with your friends, taking a workshop, or you're watching a demo, the person doing the demo will go through and say, yeah, we don't need this branch, chop. We don't need that branch, chop. This branch is too long, chop. But what they don't tell you is the repercussions of that chop. And what happens when those buds come out, the internode's very long, and you're the one that won the raffle tree? Well, good luck, right? Oh, they didn't tell you about that. They're gone. They cashed a check, okay? So Now you start figuring out that it's not a matter of looking at this and saying, yeah, it's a little long, we should cut it. Now it becomes very important as to when do you actually cut it to where you want it to divide. We can always look at a branch and say, I don't think you need that branch. And we got to get rid of it, which is probably true. The real question is, when do you get rid of it? Because you might be cutting off a branch and now the tree's not feeding it and it feeds everything left over. And everything left over starts growing stronger than you want. If it's stronger, if you cut something off and the tree is stronger and you want that, then that's great. You know exactly what to do. But if you cut it off and you worry that these branches will start growing long and now you have a bunch of unusable branches, like maybe I shouldn't cut the whole thing off yet. Or maybe I should cut it in a way to weaken it or slow it down so you don't get that response. There's all sorts of strategy. Maybe you cut the branch and you say, okay, no more food for this tree. And that's your strategy. You could do that too. Okay. You definitely don't want to cut your tree back and say, well, this tree's kind of big, and then start feeding heavy, because then you just grew back what you cut off. All right. So when you get more into learning about bonsai, you'll find that the name of the game is growing the tree at the rate that you want it to grow. It's got to grow in a way that you can manage the tree and build what you want to build. So growing a tree 100% max speed is not always beneficial to you, even if the tree is raw material. And usually you would think, oh, this tree is young. I think I'm supposed to grow it very strong. The problem is that when it's young, the tree is very strong. And then you grow it stronger on top. And now you're trying to figure out, well, how come my internodes are so long? That's the beauty of that Seiju elm, is that the internodes are so short. And if you cut it a few times and get more branches, they stay short very easily. And you don't even have to think about long internodes anymore. You just like cut, oh, it buds out, perfect. Oh, it's growing out again, I just cut, okay, it grows more branches. Internode is just not an issue with those trees. But trees that have long internodes become more technically challenging, okay? Especially when you get into black pines that grow long internodes, okay? So how do you adjust those things other than, okay, well, as you get more and more trees, so that's a technical way of cutting it to just get the buds you want to not grow a long internode. Another way to get shorter internodes is having a lot of branches on your tree. If the tree has to feed all these branches, it's unlikely that one's going to suddenly do this. It might spike a little bit, and then over time, if you don't do anything, then it finally gets stronger. And so you'll find, just as you divide the tree more, going from 2 to 3 to 4, there's more branches to feed. They start to slow down because you have to feed so many branches, and you'll find that your overall tree starts to slow down. Branches are thinner, internodes are shorter. It's easier to manage. And you can use that, just like the sacrifice branch. You can keep a bunch of branches on your tree. Like when you're looking at this, most of the time when people look at that, they'll be like, that kind of dense, right? There's no leaves on it yet, right? But once the leaves really open up, it's gonna be jammed. You're like, Peter, should we thin this out or something? Okay. The reason why I keep so many branches there is, one, we do have to kind of recalibrate and figure out, well, what is too many? Most of us think that this is too many. Generally, I would say that's not enough. So just recalibrating what you consider as dense, having a lot of branches. The other reason why I might be keeping all these branches is that I know I don't want that branch that's here that's growing down or touching this other branch. But you know what? If I kept both of them right now, that whole top slows down. And that really helps in me trying to grow this branch. And then once I get some of these lower branches done and I'm working on smaller stuff, then I'll go back and say, yeah, I don't really need that. I don't really need that. You start cleaning. So it's a matter of when, right? We figured out that maybe there is too many branches. But when do you get rid of them? If you're too quick to cut them out, whatever's left gets stronger, and now you're fighting to keep them back, and you're trying to grow something down here. You see how that can kind of hurt you just because it looks funny right now. You have to be able to accept that, because it's not a visual thing. That's not the artistic. It's just a technical thing. right? Do I really want that many branches growing from that one spot? Seems excessive, okay? I'm keeping them all now, and when they grow out, I'm keeping them short, which generally means they don't swell very much because I'm trying to get this to grow. If I start thinning this out, whatever's left here grows faster, and now I have to fight it even harder. Because instead of each of these branches growing this much, I take half of them and they all grow this much. And, and also on a trident maple, the internodes are longer too when you do that because it's stronger. Stronger branches have longer internodes. They have bigger leaves. The branches are thicker. If you don't allow them to get very strong, they stay small, they stay skinny. They bunch up together and it almost slow itself down. You can use that as a tool to get other things done on your tree. So that in turn, they become sacrifice branches. So sacrifice branches aren't always just, well, I'm thickening this branch and I'm going to chop it off. That's a sacrifice branch. Okay, usually we think of it that way. But this little branch here that I don't like is a sacrifice branch too. It's there to take some of that food so that everything else doesn't grow so strong. All the way to the point where you're satisfied with what you've created, and the tree's going to grow extra branches. You're like, I can't afford to keep that branch because it's going to slow the other branches down. And now you have to thin your tree out just to keep whatever's left going. You went so far to the other side now. Okay, you're not worried that something's going to blow out. You're worried that it won't grow because there's too many. The tree cannot support that kind of structure. Like a trident maple, you can get it pretty dense. You can't get it as dense as that elm. It's very hard for that tree to do that. It will just start losing branches. So there's kind of a cap for each type of tree. Just like you can't get a black pine to grow branches this tight. It just physically can't fit. They'll bump into each other. So there's a natural spacing for that kind of tree. But generally, because of our manipulation, the natural spacing is a little bit smaller because we're trying to be more proportionate in our tree build here. Okay. If you look at a big tree growing outside and you see its natural spacing, you'll notice a lot of times the foliage branches never touch each other. Okay, they're close, but they never touch each other. Usually they grow far enough that their foliage generally doesn't touch each other that much too. But when they do, something always goes. That branch dies off, the tree grows in a different direction because it can't grow jammed up like this anyways. And so it weeds itself out. So again, with this tree, if I walked away from it and let it grow, it's going to weed its weak branches out and start getting big again. Okay. If you're curious what these are, right? These are thread grafts. Are you guys familiar with thread grafts? Okay, it's a cool trick that you can use, or a cool technique. It's not really a trick, it's a technique on, let's say, on this trident maple, where you can grow a branch out. Hey, perfect. I'm trying to thicken this branch, so hey, I'm gonna use that long branch. I drill a hole through the tree. I stick the branch through. Of course, the leaves are gone. I pin it. I let the outside grow, and at some point, it'll start to meld, and then I can cut the back off. And now I get to put a branch where I want it. And I did that a number of times on this tree because there was a lot of branches down here. There was a bunch of branches up here and none in the middle. And sometimes we get that. Okay. That's one way to get branches where you don't want, where you don't have it. Okay. So that's what that's all about. They haven't taken yet, that's why I haven't cut it. The red tag means something's happening here. Don't walk through the garden and start cutting. Okay. You don't want to do this and be like, what's this? And you cut it. Oh, shoot. Okay. Yeah.
I have a question on your thread graph.
Yeah.
You have the long one because you're growing it out to thicken it. At
Yeah.
what point can you use that branch for a thread graft? And when,
This one.
yeah,
Oh, generally, I'll grow it out when it's long enough where I can safely bring it around, drill it, and put it through. So, but usually these branches aren't very old also, because older branches, they start to divide and now you can't stick the thing through your tree. Okay, so you're usually using younger areas like this. This is a good example of kind of common size. Can you thread graft branches that are thicker? Yes. As the branches get thicker, sometimes it's not so easy to fold it around anymore. Or you make sure that when it's young, you start to fold early, and then as it continues to grow, it's thicker, but you've already have it in the spot you want. Now here's a question. If I needed to thread graft a bunch of branches on this trunk, do I thread graft a branch that I need down here, in the middle, or on the top first? Which one should I do? Or should I do all three? Since I'm already there. That's right. So now that becomes a when. We all know how to thread graft, no problem. I can thread graft any tree. And you're like, I need a thread graft here, here, and here. If I thread graft all three, what's the top thread graft going to do? It's going to grow strongest, right? What's going to happen to the two bottom ones? Now you got to fight that that thread graft on the top just to get the bottom two going. It might be to your advantage to do the bottom one first, give it a head start, and then thread graft the top later. Again, prioritizing. Okay. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you just do it now. Make sure you plan it out, prioritize. What's more important? Grafting in number 5 or grafting in number 2? Yes. Align the nodes. Okay, so when I drill a hole through the tree, and one key thing is always drill a hole bigger than you think you need, because you don't want to stick the thread graft through and then break the bud off. And then it'll take, but then your first bud is like way over here. And you've just thread grafted a leggy branch. I try to get that first bud close. Now, are you talking about that as a position, like, oh, how close should that node be? Or are you talking like a directional point kind of thing?
Inside a node inside the trunk or
Oh,
at the
yeah,
start
yeah.
of the trunk?
Yeah, and that's if say you have a bunch of nodes on your tree and you stick it through the tree and there is a node inside the tree, that's okay. It'll just get all gobbled up in there. And it's really only the stuff that exits that's usable, and the back end gets cut off when it's taken here. This part gets cut off. So I don't worry about nodes inside the tree. Sometimes I'll even break the buds because they kind of jam up in there a little bit. Okay. But it is important that when where you place that first node, it's in a spot where you potentially want it to divide. You don't put it far out. A little extra tip, you don't want to put it too close, because when it takes and it calluses, it becomes a ball, and sometimes it'll eat your node if it's too close and absorb it. And then you're like, on the next node, you're like, oh shoot, it's way out here. So there's a fine line. Usually I always set it, I think about, I want it to grow right here. I want this bud to be right here. I always think, okay, a little further out to account for that bulge. Here's an example of that bulge, if you can see it. This was a thread graft that was done maybe last year or 2 years ago. So you see how there's a little bit of a dome right here. It's like a little mountain. So that part can become big. You can see it's pretty close to that. If that bud was a little closer, it would have ate it, and maybe now it won't bud. So that's just a little tip there. You want it close, but don't forget about that mounting that's going to happen. I brought this small tree, same concept. The only thing about small trees, or when you get into shohins, is that fundamentally what you're doing on these big trees, some of it is the same, but just like anytime you get into something very small, sometimes the rule changes. And what you do on these trees don't apply anymore because it doesn't work anymore. It's too small. Okay. I'm not going to get deep into shohin, but just realize that as your trees get smaller and smaller, it sometimes isn't always a straight normal thing that you did here and somehow translate to something so tiny. About the only thing easy about this is the weight. Okay. It's very difficult. The timing on when you have to cut it is so important because it's small. And what is a short internode here is way too long here. And you're like, that means my technique in getting that shorter internode has to be really on point. You can afford something a little long on this. Okay, it was a 1/2 inch. I didn't want that, but tree's so big, nobody sees it. 1/2 inch on this is like, oh, that was wasted. I got to grow something that's 1/8 of an inch. And what if you don't know how? Now you're just like, the tree's not getting any better. And that's also why I tell people that when they start in bonsai, don't start with this. Okay, if you want to learn it, start with things that are a little bit bigger. Doesn't have to be giant, but something bigger. Because little mistakes, the tree can absorb that and you can keep building and working it. You're not starting year one over because you just, oops, I didn't cut it on time. It's like, well, you lost this year. Hope you remember to cut it on time next year. Okay. Or you cut it on time for 3 years and the 4th year, you didn't cut it and then the branch dies. And you're like, well, that was 4 years. Yeah, this bonsai sucks. Yeah, that's tough. Okay. So I just brought that to mention, don't get too into that too quick if you're trying to learn bonsai. It's much harder to learn on a small tree than it's something that's a little bit bigger because it's more forgiving. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about next is a little bit on this tree and then this tree right here. Okay, so before I do that, okay, so we talked about these trident maples here. We talked about the elm there. If you didn't get a chance to come up and take a closer look at the tree, feel free to come up, look inside, look from the bottom up. Just kind of see, again, where are you seeing some of the cuts? Where was the last cut? What has happened since that cut? And do you see subsequent cuts after that? Sometimes I'll use that as a way to kind of read what the tree has been doing for the last couple of years, straight up for a while because it's a certain size. And then we see this cut, and surprise, surprise, where did the tree grow when this was cut? It grew right here, and it grew here in varying sizes. And you notice that the branches that are growing below that cut right here are tiny, okay? Because what does the tree want to do? It wants to get bigger. So I can look at this and kind of gauge like, okay, that was the first cut, second cut, they grew that, they got to a thickness, they cut it, and then here we are. I don't see any other cuts. This is a dead piece right here. That probably is something that just died and then it split. Okay. So sometimes when you look at the tree like that, you can kind of read it because you can see where some of the cuts were. Even if the cuts aren't as obvious like this, you might see evidence of there was a cut and it healed over because the callus is going to be younger than the branch. So there'll be a slight discoloration and you can say, oh, okay, that's the cut, but we just don't see a blunt cut anymore. So let's talk about time and money, right? Just in case you didn't know, bonsai is not the cheapest hobby, okay? Right? Don't scare them all, yeah. I remember when I first bought my first Japanese maple, that was $100. This is years ago when I was newer, and I was just like walking out of the garden center, which is where I found it. And I'm holding this like 3-gallon container, and I'm like, oh, it's getting serious now. It's getting real serious now. I'm spending $100. I can't believe it. I just bought a plant for $100. Okay. So let's talk about this tree or some of these other trees and just talk about the sizes. I can't remember. Are you guys okay in saying how much this costs? Do you remember how much it costs? Okay, so $185, bought it from a grower that grew this tree. And at some point, branches grew out. You can tell there's scars on the trunk here. And this scar is actually healed. So there was something bigger that got chopped off a long time ago, long enough that it healed and new branches grew from that cut. So we can say at some point it got cut here, these guys grew, and then we see those subsequent cuts. And you look at the trunk caliber, and it's got a certain size. You can kind of look down and see the root spread. Right? Something like this, if it was grown in the ground, and then the grower would go through and cut branches here and there to kind of shape some stuff or get the tree to grow in a certain direction to develop some kind of taper. Growing in the ground, I don't know if he told you how old this tree is, but it was probably grown for about 5 years. I'm going to guess. Maybe 6? Okay. It doesn't mean that you can't grow a trident maple bigger faster. It just depends on how big did the guy want to grow it. Because I've seen trident maple trunks get this big after 3 years in the ground when it was this big. Okay, the growing environment was just perfect. They just let it blow out. Okay, and now you got this like giant tree. Okay. So this guy right here, it's a certain size. Let's say it takes 7 years to grow it to that size. Let's just make it easy. Let's just say 5 years. This tree actually came from the same grower. And it was in a nursery container. It might have been in a Anderson flat, I can't remember. And I just repotted it, cut a bunch of roots off. But some of these branches or all these other branches here that were just like this, I had cut. These new branches grew out last year. I wired some of them I'm letting run. So this guy's bigger. I think I paid 500 or something for that. I think it was $500 or $600. Okay. So it was essentially this. There was something about the trunk that I like. I paid say $500. I didn't know what was in here, which we don't know. All we know is that it grew into the ground a little bit. I cut all the branches and I've had it for almost about a year now. Okay. How long does it take to grow that tree to this size? We're saying 5, 8, 9, okay. Let's say an additional 4 years, okay. So you got a tree that's essentially about $200. I think he probably gave you guys a deal. Yeah, 180 seems a little cheap. He probably sells it for 250, probably maybe closer to 3, but so let's say 250, I would think is what he would normally charge. 250, 500, 4 more years, bigger trunk. Which one's the better buy? Short of, unless you want something small. Okay. If you were looking for something bigger or something older, because this is actually physically older than that tree, bigger trees give you a little bit more flexibility in the styles that you can create. Whereas a small tree, you're a little limited, right? Because you can only make it so big, because it'll look disproportionate. It'll be like a tiny trunk and this giant canopy. So that's something to think about when you're picking up trees or you're looking at trees. Okay, we talked about the diagram of looking at the trunk, making sure you're happy with that. And you might see this tree and you say, oh, it's $250. Well, I can afford that. And then you look at this tree and it's double the price. Again, it was in a nursery container. Okay, and it had branches just like that. But you're like 500, an extra 250, and it saved me 4 years if I bought that to then grow it, assuming that you have the ability to grow it to this size in 4 years, because that's a whole bunch of stuff you have to learn too. So if you have to learn it, it's probably going to take you 6, 7 years, because you're probably doing stuff that's counter to how to get the tree that big. Okay. So think about the time also. When we're looking at this tree or this tree, and now you're going from this to this, what would be the difference in time? How many steps ahead is this tree to that tree? Let's just say, assume the trunk is the same, okay? And it's not bigger or smaller. So there wasn't time spent making the trunk bigger, let's say they're the same size, but there was time building these branches. Now, how long did it take to build these branches? You probably don't know because I didn't tell you yet. Let's see, it took maybe a year or 2 to grow these main branches, maybe a year for the secondaries, and then the third, some of these cuts along the way, and I did some thread grafts along the way. So let's say from this one to this one, it's about 3, maybe 4 years more, okay? So you're going from this one to this one to this one. And this is also developing the tree in a way that starts it off, where you can take it and keep building. You're not at the stage where I think I got to chop a lot of branches off to get new branches to come out. These are usable branches here already. So you factor that time in and you factor that the branches are usable and it's not something like that where you have to cut a bunch of stuff off. You're like, okay, I saved some time. Now the question is, how much is this, right? If that was an issue. Now the tough thing in pricing bonsai is sometimes we look at the trunk and we'll say, well, usually a trunk like that, you know, there's going to be some indicators out there that tell you that, okay, they're about this much. So you know that if somebody's charging too much, you're like, oh, that's way overpriced. Or if somebody's charging too low and you're like, oh, this is a great deal. Okay. When you get into something like this, where the starting point is done well and you can just take it over, that becomes very valuable also, because from this to even this is kind of hard to find, because a lot of people do not understand the concept of building something like this. Okay. So let's say you look at this tree and it's a giant tree, you like the root spread, but the branches look like that. And now you know I like the trunk, maybe I like 1, 2, 3, but all the branches are not ideal. And now you got to cut all the branches to regrow them. Well, at least you don't have to grow the trunk. And just, okay, well, how much did this trunk cost? Okay. And let's say 10 years ago, this trunk was $2,000. With my graft out. Jeez. And you start figuring out, it's just like, okay, it was 250, 500, and let's say 2,000, because these are a little rarer too. Finding something bigger takes a long time to grow. This tree is about 35, 40 years old, something like that. But you look at the branches and all the branches are really close. They're not like that. So there's added value to that, which is why this tree costs more than that. So same thing with this one. If you can get something like this, which again is hard to come by because most of the time people aren't cutting them short enough to then get this. What you really end up finding a lot of times is stuff like this that you start moving to this, then this, then this. If you look at the whole time period and say this was started 35 years ago in growing the trunk, I grew the root system and most of these branches in the last 10 years. So you figure, so you're asking yourself, well, okay, 35 years or 30 years, and then 10 years of somebody working on the tree and branches, what is that valued at? Okay. Now, the tough thing with bonsai is that when you get to something like this, the value is hard to determine because something like this is a little, it's not like, well, we can go to Walmart and get a couple of them, right? There's a set price when it's that way. When there's only one and you're like, I don't see another one anywhere, that gets a little tricky because someone can just say, well, I want 10 grand or I want 20 grand. It almost is the same. You can throw out any number because there is no other one you can get, right? So the pricing of that gets a little tricky. But stuff like this you can find because there are people that are growing up, right? So if you find something like this and the trunk is really good, or you find something like this and it's only a little bit more, you saved yourself a bunch of time, which in turn is kind of like money too, even though it seems like you're paying a lot for this versus that one. Okay. There's a lot of these, there's less of these. So these are a little bit more impressive or a little bit more valued because of that. Okay. You can finish this tree to be full like this, just like you can do the same work on this one and finish it, and this would be more valuable automatically, just because it's bigger, got a little bit more power. Those you're kind of like, yeah, I mean, a lot of people grow them, so they're not too exciting sometimes, okay, because of just the size. But if you like small trees, that's perfect. Not everybody needs a giant tree. They are kind of heavy, okay. Right. There's no leaves on it. It's even heavier when there's leaves on it. Okay. So when you're looking at trees and you're thinking about the cost of trees, there's a lot of things to factor in. Okay, how old the tree is, what work has been done, and was that work valuable? You know, it's always hard to tell somebody when they put a lot of time in a tree and then it's like, well, no value in that. That kind of sucks. Okay. purely because going back to can we look at that diagram one more time? Okay. It's a little tough when you look at a piece of material, and which is why I focus on 1 and 2 and 3 first, is that sometimes 4 and 5 can fool you a little bit. You see something out there and it's looking good, or it has some kind of a shape, or say it has 5 and it has 6, and the tree is full, like this procumbens nana right here. See, it's real full, it's got a triangular shape. Kind of looks nice, it's happy. Would anybody want that tree? Okay. You know, some people would. Okay. The tough thing about it is that when you look at the structure of the tree and say you're trying to develop high quality bonsai, you're looking at the silhouette and you're like, this looks really nice. But then when you look on the inside and you find out that number 2 is actually this long and number 3 is right here. And you're like, wow, that tree is actually kind of leggy. It's just hidden by all this green that's randomly growing around. So how do you get it to grow right here or divide right there? Because you're looking at like, wow, that branch is really long before it divides. It's out here. How do I get it to divide here? How did we get this to divide there? You cut it, right? Now with a juniper, you do have to cut to some kind of green. You can't just cut to a bare branch. You'll die. But you kind of, you know what I'm saying. You got to make a cut. And you got to get the division here, which means if you're cutting it right here, what you liked about the tree or the fullness of the tree is now gone. There's a giant hole in your tree. If you cut that branch off right here because you want it to divide, and you have a branch up above where it's further out and it's putting this in the dark, is that going to grow well? No. So what do you have to do with that? You have to cut also, because it's in your way, because that's a low priority. It's 4 and 5. You're trying to develop 2 to 3, and 4 and the 5 is in your way. In your way. So you have to be careful with trees like this. I'm not saying this is a totally bad tree, but you have to look deeper in the tree, because sometimes when we go to a show or go in a garden center, we see the silhouette like, wow, I think I have something. And then you look inside and you're like, well, I really want it to divide right here, but it's dividing here. And the only way to get it to divide there is cutting it there. So whatever work you put on the tree from this point all the way out here is thrown away. That's one of the hardest parts about bonsai, is that when you're building from the beginning, 1 and 2, if you skip something and then it's not developed well and you do 3, 4, and 5 perfectly, and then later you wish 2 was perfect, you have to throw away your perfect 3, 4, and 5 to make 2 perfect, or the way you want it, which is heartbreaking. You skip the step early in the development of the tree. Now the tree has a bunch of ramification, or it's developed better, but now number 2 is a little too leggy. Leggy enough that it distracts from the overall quality of the tree, or it takes the quality of the tree down. Doesn't mean long internodes are always bad for a tree, but let's just say in this case, it is. All the work that you put on it after that one area that wasn't addressed properly, you don't get to keep any of it if you actually wanted to fix it. Okay? That's why it's so important when you see your tree and you see 1, 2, 3, and you're liking 4 and 5, you gotta make sure 2 and 3 is to your liking. You can't be like 4 and 5 is great, but 2 is a little rough and 3 is a little rough. It doesn't work. It's like having a bad foundation in your house. Doesn't matter how good your house looks, right? If the foundation is no good, it's gonna fall apart or sink. And that's the hardest part, is that you lose it all. Or here's another scenario. You have a tree you're growing and it's looking real good. You're real happy. And you're not familiar with fungus, and the fungus kills this entire branch. Now you have a big hole in your tree. You have the rest of your tree built, and now you're trying to rebuild your main branch. So let's just say it dies, but a little bud comes out. So now you got to thicken that branch. You have to then cut it, get it to divide, thicken those branches, cut it and divide, essentially redid what you did. The problem with it is that if you're growing this branch out, at some point you have to cut it here to go from 2 to 3, and you have 6, 7, 8, 9 on top. What do you have to do to them to be successful here? It all has to get cut like this. So you got to be careful about those kind of things, or at least not to scare you or anything, but you have to be aware that whatever you're building, because the tree wants to get bigger, when you're building the tree, if you lose an area of your tree, or you're trying to change something that's foundational, like 1 and 2, you can't change those things or redevelop them without getting rid of your 4s, 5s, and 6s, and 7s. It can be very costly, to the point where you might say, you know, maybe I'll just restyle the tree and not try to grow that branch back. It might be more worthwhile to you. Or this also then illustrates how important it is to keep your branches alive, especially your major ones. Now, we all have trees. We probably all have too many trees, right? And so you have a certain amount of bench space, and you buy another tree, and you're like, well, I think I can fit it in here. We just kind of stick it in there, you know, stick that tree in there, okay? So when you start putting trees close together, it's not the top that gets blocked out. It's probably your lowest branches that gets blocked out. The one that's one of the hardest things to grow back or change. Because this is growing just fine. And now these are touching, or it's shading that one out, that's shading, or even it's touching, okay, each other. And now the bottom branch gets weak, and then one day you lose it. That's not the best way to maintain your trees or continue the development. So you don't want to get trapped, or you want to get caught up in that. It does matter when you have your trees and how much space they have, because you might be working against yourself. Now, I've been doing bonsai for a very long time, and I worked with a lot of people. And you'll be surprised how often we end up accidentally doing things with our trees that us unknowingly, we're setting ourselves back. Something as simple as, I'm trying to grow this branch out. You look at it and you're like, well, it's kind of long. I'm going to cut it off right there because it doesn't look good. You're like, no, I was trying to thicken it. How long does it take if I cut this off for it to regrow and then this continues to start thickening? It could be an easy year automatically, okay? Just because you cut that off by accident, or it was sticking in the walkway, or you know, a basketball landed on it and broke it. You're like, oh no. Okay. So you don't want to accidentally add time to your development. I don't know about you, but after so many years, I kind of want to see some results, right? Okay. That's ideal, right? Okay. If after a period of time, I mean, this is not to pick on anybody, but after a certain period of time as you're developing trees, if you're finding that your trees are not becoming more refined, or they're getting better, or they're not getting better, I mean, it's probably something you're doing, right? It's your tree, right? Okay. If something's not working out in my garden, I start thinking about, well, why is it not working out? What do I need to adjust? I don't just keep doing the same thing. Okay. Through that, sometimes you can learn all these little extra things that you didn't really think about. Like, well, I'm trying to grow this branch out, but if I grow it too fast, the internodes are too long, I can't use it. So I just wasted 5 years growing a branch this thick with no branches that will come out of it. You see, you don't want to lose that 5 years. Like, that's crazy, right? Okay. Move these guys apart. It's getting weak as we speak. No. All right. Any questions about that? Okay. So I'm going to make some cuts on this tree, and it's going to be very straightforward. But I'll also talk to you why I'm cutting this tree. Did you guys buy all your raffle tickets for this tree yet? Okay, that's good. I'm glad you bought it for. because you're not going to get a lot of tree back, right? It'll fit in the car better. Yeah. Yeah. It'll be shorter. Okay. All right. So before I start cutting, again, we covered, you got to be careful when you look at trees like this because the silhouette can be very enticing and you're like, oh, wow, it looks like I can just put it on the bench. It looks nice right now. But if you're getting into real structural, real high quality bonsai, you got to look a little closer and make sure you are happy with what's inside. Because it's easy to regrow the foliage. That happens automatic as long as you keep the tree alive. But sometimes it's not so easy to fix those number twos. So you better be happy with it if you're buying a tree that's that shape. Or you're buying that tree because you like the trunk and the canopy is you're not worried about the canopy at all, and you're ready to make those chops to make 1 to 3 look better. And so what are you really buying now? You're buying 1 and 2, and you're fixing 3, or you're continuing the development on 3. Like on that main branch right there, that's what I'm referencing. And then what does the other parts of the tree do while you're working on 2 to 3? You got to figure out how to keep them at bay while you're working on 2 to 3, because you can't let 5 and 6 develop generally, because they get in the way of your 2 to 3. So be careful about things like this. Short of, unless you like the tree for what it is, and you're not planning on chopping a bunch of stuff off, then that's perfect. That's the tough part about evaluating some trees. You might look at a tree and say, this tree is $500. 10 years from now, it'll be $500. Or 10 years from now, it'll be 10 grand, whatever the case. There's room for improvement. And some trees, well, 2 to 3 is so bad that it doesn't matter that 4, 5, and 6 is great. 2 to 3 is so poor that nobody wants to buy it now, even though the canopy is nice and round. Okay. Now, getting a round canopy is not that difficult. I mean, again, we can just like buy a bush and just shave it. It'll be round. Okay. Gardeners do that all the time. Okay. So now we know there's something a little bit more to bonsai because we're not just hedging trees. So when I look at this tree, just some practical things about this tree is I'll look at the fact that it's a nursery container. The nursery container, I can see a root growing out of it, so it's growing into the ground, or maybe it was partially in the ground. So we know that there's probably some big roots down there. Most people don't put a tree with a shallow root system in a big pot like that. Normally, they don't do that. So you have to go in knowing that there's probably something in there that we need to address. Because for the most part, when we're dealing with bonsai, they end up going into much smaller, shallower pots. So you automatically go in knowing there's that root. Do we have to bring out a sawzall to make some cuts? Is it so crazy in there that there's no way of cutting and getting the root system better? Do we have to air layer the tree? That's usually the fastest way to get better root system. And whoever takes this tree home, you can do an air layer now, and I would recommend doing that. If you don't know how to do an air layer, I mean, the club has workshops. There's plenty of people that know how, and they can tell you how. If the tree starts to leaf out, you can still do it. Another time that I can air layer is in May when the leaves have hardened off. Okay. So I'm looking at this side right here. It kind of has, the tree was kind of pruned for that side to be the front. So let's just say I'm going to pick that just to make things a little faster. You try to find the front of the tree that shows the best part of that particular type of tree. Is it that it has a really good root flare? Does it have details on the trunk that's interesting? Okay, what is it about trident maples, or what are the parts of trident maples that are attractive to us? Is it how they look when they get older? Is it taper? A bunch of branches? It's generally all of those. Usually we don't try to get deadwood on trident maples. So that's usually not on our radar. Nobody's looking at a trident maple and says, well, the deadwood's so great. Okay, that's not as important. But if it was a juniper, like a collected juniper, and it has no dead wood, be like, that's not kind of young because all the old ones have a lot of dead wood. Okay, so different types of trees, you're looking for different things. You're looking at this tree and you're saying, okay, I like the flare in the trunk. It goes up. I like the size. We're not going to try to change number one. We go up, we see some of these lower branches that were cut. And now you have to think about, okay, well, what do I want this tree to look like? Which is, I'm not envious of people who are new in bonsai, and I was new in bonsai. Where do you even start? Yeah, we talked about, okay, moving from 1 to 2, 2 to 3. But where's that 1 to 2? Is it here? Is it here? And maybe we chop these branches off? Or is that really my main branch? Okay, that part I didn't tell you looking at the diagram. So it does require you in the beginning to get a basic idea of what is it that you want the tree to look like, because that would be the difference between cutting this one short to get it to bud out or cutting it off completely because you actually want to use the branch above it as your main branch. So how do you get past that? How do you know? And in the beginning, you don't know. And you either like, well, I saw a tree at a show the other day and it was about there, so maybe I'll go with that. And that's all we can do, unless somebody's there to tell you. And hopefully they're telling you the right thing to do. Okay. And they might be telling you what they would do, but maybe that's not what you want. That happens too. You know, they're telling you, yeah, cut all those lower branches because they just like tall trees. And you're like, well, I kind of want short, squatty trees. Okay. I do recommend for those of you guys that are new or even experienced, there's no way around looking at somebody's work and then deciding, should you listen to what they have to say? That's what I did when I started, okay? Which seems like, well, I should have just figured that out, but I didn't, because people can talk a really good game. If you see somebody create a tree and say they're showing it and you really like it, it's probably a good idea to listen to what they have to say, because they can at least give you that. If you're looking at a tree and you're like, what is up with this tree? Yeah, you probably don't want to take their advice, because they're going to give you that, right? And that's not what you want. It seems simple, but I know I've been in clubs, and when I started, about 10 different people told me to do 10 different things on my tree. And I was like, who really knows? I see where this is going. And you can get into that trap. You cut one branch off, somebody says, well, you should have kept that. Okay, well, I'll grow it. And then the other guy says, well, you need to cut it off. And you see how you're repeating the same year over and over. Okay. The best thing to do is, yeah, find people that you know create quality trees. Look at magazines, look at books, go to shows. Start building up a library of certain shapes or styles that you like. And then generally in the beginning, I recommend this for everybody, you just try to copy that and go see if you can do that. I'm not saying that you can't be creative and do what you want, but it's easy to copy and just kind of get a feel. Okay, I notice if I cut it here, it grows here. If nothing else, you get a better understanding of how the tree grows in response to your work and your environment, your soil, how you repot, how you wire the tree, how you manage pests, fungus. So once you build that library, you start getting a feel, you start working on trees, you're working on more trees. Okay, I kind of made a mistake on this tree. I learned my lesson. I don't make that mistake on this tree. And your collection gets better and better as you learn more and more. So what are we going to do with this tree? What I'm going to do, and this can work for everybody, is that you look at this tree and you say, okay, the part I can't change is the trunk. I have a bunch of branches everywhere. I'm not even sure I need all of them, but I don't even know which ones I want. An easy thing to do with material like this, a trident maple that you can cut back pretty hard, is that you don't have to overthink it. You know you can't use a lot of these heavy branches that are growing out because they're either sticking straight up or too horizontal, or the internode's too long. You got something that's really big on the top, but we're thinking maybe we should have something thicker on the bottom. There's just all this stuff that was randomly growing, and you're trying to make sense of it all. Usually what I do is I'll look at the trunk line, and I know I'm going to retain most of that, or at least a big section of that, from the ground all the way up to about here. Because once you get into skinnier branches, well, you can grow that all day long. That's easy. So I don't even see that. I see the part that's harder to change, which is this area. Okay. So wherever you see a branch growing out from the trunk, you know that on the trunk, just like on this branch, it has nodes, and that's where these branches came from. If this was field grown, there's probably no thread grafts or anything like that, so we don't have to worry about it. So you know that if this branch grew from this point, there's a node, which means there's a bud at the base. And looking at this tree, say I'm looking at, let's see, this branch right here. There's actually a node right there, and then the base, which is a node also. If I look at the collar of the base and it's not damaged, like old scars, chances are 99% of the time when you cut it, something's going to bud out from that point. If you see a lot of damage, then now it's a little dicey. You don't know. So in this case, where I see that it's not damaged, I can freely just cut the branch with or without a node, knowing that it will bud from the base. If you think the base is damaged, then cut to one node so that if it doesn't grow at the base, it will grow at that first node. Now, you might not be happy with that still. So you have to kind of think about, well, if I cut it and it doesn't bud at the base and it buds here because I left a node, did I still get what I wanted? And if that's no, then you have to do something about it. Maybe you do have to graft the branch if you really need to, if it doesn't bud out. But for this tree, I guarantee that all the cuts I'm going to make today, in the next few weeks as it's warming up, we're supposed to get kind of cold, but it's going to get warm. Okay. You'll start seeing stuff budding out from the trunk or whatever little nubs that I leave. So let's say, for example, I'm not a fan of this first branch, but I want to use it. I'm not a fan of it because of the fact that it's growing up and it's kind of a hook shape. And say I don't want that, which means now I have to replace it because I can't bend that branch. Like you can't just bend the deciduous tree. They snap too easily, just like that. And this is small, right? So let's say I cut it right there. And I leave a little nub because I want to keep the collar intact because that's where it's going to bud out. So let's say that's my number 2. I'm waiting for my number 2 to show up. And it's going to show up in the spring. And it's going to grow a certain amount in the spring. And in May, we'll probably wire it, and then you'll probably let it run to thicken to whatever size you're looking for. If I'm waiting for number 2 to show up, what happens to all the branches above it? Right? So you go through. And so in a way, I mean, if you're okay with cutting your tree and you're not worried about, don't worry, you're not killing the tree. It can handle this. It becomes very straightforward because I look at my trunk and I say, I have number 1. I'm waiting for number 2 out. Unfortunately, it didn't have a 2 that I can use. So I'm waiting for it to come out so I can then grow it, which means 3, 4s, 5s, 6s, 7s, all unimportant. And you have to get it out of your way. So some of these are kind of big. Let me see if I can cut it so you can see it. Usually when you cut a big branch on the deciduous tree, it's a little hard on the end cut, so I do a second cut so it's a little flatter. This is a branch in the back that's growing up. Again, I'm leaving a little nub so that it can bud out at the base. Now, if I cut it this way and walked away and I didn't cut the rest, what's going to happen? Where's the tree going to grow? It'll just grow here. They'd be like, oh, okay, I guess I'm not growing there. I'll just grow here, which the tree loves to do. So when you're doing a cut like this to try to maximize how much branches you get coming out from the trunk, you have to be very complete in your cut. You can't cut all the branches, wait for it to bud out, and just leave this. Because the tree would just want to grow here, and you'll see less budding in this area. You'll see some, but it's not as good as if you cut everything completely down. The tree has no choice but to bud out on the collar. You're not giving it an out. This branch is a little low. I don't think I need it, but I'm not 100% sure yet. I am 100% sure that I need the tree to bud out from the trunk. So I'll just cut in and leave it. If I don't need it in the future, it's easy enough to cut it off. But you don't have to make that decision today. You just need to make the firm decisions of, I want it to bud. This is what I need to do to get it to bud out. And you're not worried about length, position just yet. Let's just see what the tree gives us. Yeah, sure, go for it. This is gonna be real fast. Yeah. Okay. Right. Don't show the color, okay. Okay. She needs a mic. Okay.
We are seeing you be very severe with this trident maple. How would you treat a Japanese maple, or just maybe to emphasize to everybody, do you do this with every species?
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, you can't do this on every tree you see, right? Okay, so for a deciduous tree like a trident maple, and trident maples are generally really strong trees, and this tree is young, that I can cut things like this. I can cut all the limbs real short and it will grow out. Like I guarantee it, okay? Now, if this was a Japanese maple, you have to be a little careful because a regular, ordinary Acer palmatum can handle this cut too. But once you get into more special varieties where there are different leaf shapes, or they grow shorter or longer internodes, like Arakawa Japanese maples, for example, if you did this, the branches will not grow back. So you have to be careful with those more special varieties of Japanese maples. If this was an elm, you can do this all day, no problem. Elms are one of the few trees where when callus forms, it will actually bud out from callus, whereas a trident will only bud out from a node point. So it's even easier on an elm to get it to bud out. So you might as well just get to it. Just make the cuts. I want it to grow here, I cut it right there. If it was this juniper or pine, let's just say it's a juniper, you got to make sure there's still some green left on your tree when you cut it back. Because if you cut to no green, then the branch usually dies. Okay, it's different. And on some other types of conifers, other types of junipers, maybe where you need to cut, even if there's green, maybe the green is too weak and you can't cut to it yet. So you cut to where it's safe. Whatever's left grows a little bit, gets a little stronger, then you cut again. And it could be a series of cuts before you get to where you actually want it to grow, which is even more problematic, right? Because if I'm trying to fix number 2 or get to 2, I'm right there, right now. We're getting to it. But then you look at this tree and you're just like, well, number 2 is way in there, but I can't cut in there because there's no green. I have to cut here. Then in July, you cut here. And then maybe now there's something in there. And maybe at the end of the year, you get to cut. So it took you a whole year. And what if it doesn't bud out? You're like, oh. And now you have to figure out, how do you get something to bud out from that area? Cutting it back didn't work. That's 1 year gone. And now someone says, well, you know, you should probably graft it. That takes a year, assuming that it takes. And that's 2 years before you even get to start growing something you want. Whereas this one, I already have a branch there. We start it right now. Yes. Well, yeah, fertilizing, if the tree is strong enough, most of the time I don't have to give it extra fertilizer to get it to bud out. But generally, trees that grow strong tends to bud back very easily too. But not always, there's always cases where, again, there was damage in that area, so it won't bud out. But yeah, if your tree is weak and part of the solution is fertilizing, getting it stronger to then get it to back bud, that could be helpful. Sometimes, no matter how strong you make the tree, it just will not bud in a certain area. Not so much on a trident, but like on some junipers, right? So in certain cases it works, other cases not so much. But that is something to think about. Can that help? Okay. When you get into bigger branches like this, because trident maple wood is very hard, and most deciduous tree wood can be very hard, especially when it's this big. If I try to cut it with this concave cutter, even if I'm strong enough to cut it, there'll be so much pressure in that wood that it'll send the crack up or down if I try to do this. So at some point, you can't just do this anymore, and we have to use a saw, which is why I have a saw. Okay, so I cut this guy, so I'm looking at the front somewhere around there, okay? Now, all that kind of extra stuff is gone, right? So now you're really focusing on the trunk line, and you know that every nub that's there, there's gonna be buds that would be coming out from the base of those. Once those new branches come out, wherever they come out, you're gonna let them grow, whoever takes it home, you're gonna let it grow until May. Those branches should be long enough that at that time, you can then go through, select, well, which branches do I really want? Sometimes there's areas where 3 branches are growing from the same point, you might not want that. You put a little wire, you decide, okay, that's gonna be my first main branch, I gotta thicken it, and then you let it do its thing. Any other branches that are above that, that's growing, you're gonna cut it fairly short and just keep a little bit. And then from that point on, you'll see that when you make that cut, you'll see it divide, and you're like, okay, I do have some ability to make a cut, get things to divide where I want it to divide. And that's a huge, it's a huge learning experience for somebody that's new, especially. You're like, okay, because that is the basis of how you get more and more branches, where you decide to make the cuts. Okay, always keeping in the back of your mind that the tree wants to get bigger, and the cuts that you're doing is redirecting where that food is going to areas that you actually want to grow to get a certain shape that you want. So if you're new or experienced and you're looking at the sheet that I handed out or that was on the backdrop, the wall here, if anything, it'll keep you, always refer to that sheet, because after a while, you'll start looking at trees that's a little further along. And sometimes it's easy to forget. Because again, the allure of 7 and 8 starts to kind of creep in. Or you're working on 2, but man, 3 and 4 is so good, it's hard for you to want to cut that off to get 2 better. Again, you just have to accept 2. It doesn't mean someone else has to accept the 2. You have to accept it. You have to say, I like this branch for what it is. Here's my next division. And you go from there. And that's your creative decision, not somebody else's. Okay, so don't confuse that. Okay. Just looking at this tree where the branches are coming out, let's just say, for example, these little nubs are parts that you're keeping, and it's going to bud from those cut points, let's just say. You see that where I'm cutting, try to picture branches coming out close to that cut point, and you see how a branch comes out of the tree and it immediately divides. And if you cut those divides short, again, then it immediately divides. And before you know it, over time, you'll get a lot of branches on your tree. As opposed to leaving these guys very long, cutting it here, and then it divides there. By the time you get to your final sides, it's a little on the thin side. It's not very ramified because you couldn't quite get it to the length that you wanted. So that's why I cut it this way. The key is you now know that you can do this on a trident. I've done it a million times. I've never had one die. I've done it to a tree like this and cut almost all the roots off. And yeah, you know. And they still do it. I did it on this one, okay? I did it on all of these. You don't even want to know what the roots look like on this one, all right? I cut a lot of it off, right? Because I know it can recover from it. I'm not purposely trying to kill the tree. You just don't want to waste a bunch of time being a little too light on the work when you can get right to it. But would I do that on this black pine here? Of course not. That can't handle that. So that's just understanding the difference between trees. So I stripped this down bare bones to pretty much nubs on and think about, okay, we're going to, you have the blueprint in deciding, okay, whatever branches come out, I need to thicken some of the lower ones. I need to cut the tops so that they don't keep growing and trying to take over the bottom. You got some thickening to do on some branches. Some branches you're going to be cutting, and then you're going from there on. You're working on 2. When do you work on 3? These are things you want to find out. Because I didn't talk about time frame or when to actually work on the tree. That's a whole nother conversation. But the first step is going to be May. That's going to be the big time to work on this tree after what I did today, unless you're going to repot the tree, which is now is the time to do that.